Hey, come here.
I'm from the future and I need to tell you some important things that have to happen. Far out. What do you need me to know? There's a lot more that needs to change than your hair. It's about the wolves in Yellowstone. They need to be saved. The history of the wolves in Yellowstone Park is an interesting one. The people that used to live there were free to kill any game that they came across, including the wolves. The gray wolf was a very vulnerable one being hunted. In 1907, the Animal Damage Control Program was introduced and killed around 1,800 wolves in the park. Eventually all the wolves were wiped out, and there were little sightings of wolves in the park for a while. Wolves used to be abundant throughout the park, and then in 1926, the last wolf in Yellowstone was killed. People had been complaining about the wolves in the park because the people who had farms around their area said wolves were coming into their ranch and killing all their animals. So what they did is killed all the wolves, and they didn't really think about their consequences. But what really happened is they had an environmental impact that was very negative. The elk population started to steadily rise in numbers. Biologists that were studying the land after the wolves were wiped out observed that the elk were multiplying in the park, and they were starting to worry about eroding land and not enough plants being in the park. Then the park had to start a control method for the wolves because they were getting out of control. They began to kill the elk as a control method, and then the hunters began to complain about there not being enough wolves to hunt. So the congressman threatened to stop funding the park. Over all this time, the quality of the range declined without the wolves being in the park. The wolves are a very essential part of the Yellowstone ecosystem and need to be reintroduced. The 1973 Act tried to reintroduce the wolf population, but early reintroduction efforts failed due to a lack of power the Act held. The Northern Rocky Mountain Wolf Recovery Plan was completed in 1980. In 1987, the plan was updated, and it concluded that in order for the wolf population to recover in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, a population of approximately 300 wolves is required. And in the early summer of 1994, a new plan of the Fish and Wildlife Services suggested that 15 wolves be reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park and Central Idaho each year after '94. Here, come inside, let me tell you.
So who is affected by these wolves in Yellowstone? What do they have to do?
People affected by wolf eradication were the government, tourists, hunters, ranchers, and the environment in Yellowstone. The way the wolves affected the government is by the money they had to fund to keep their other populations down from the wolves not being there. Some tourists enjoy seeing the wolves, and now they don't get to see them. Hunters had lost a lot of game to hunt, and they had problems with there being too much elk. The ranchers actually benefited from it somehow, because the wolves were not there to eat their animals. The whole ecosystem took a hit though, because without the wolves, the elk population shot up, and they would eat most of the plants in the ecosystem, which led to the land eroding faster and pretty much just destroying the Yellowstone ecosystem.
Yeah.
When the wolves are reintroduced, everything goes back into balance. Everything will benefit from it in their own ways.
Yeah.
The ranchers could just have a better system of keeping the wolves out of their farms. However, there were many others that were affected negatively too. The introduction plan was looking good to the Department of Interior, but it came almost to a stop in December of '97. When United States District Judge William F. Downs ruled in Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation v. Babbitt. This was an integration of 3 lawsuits that challenged the legality of the experimental wolf populations in Yellowstone National Park and Central Idaho. It was even stated that wolf reintroduction efforts in Yellowstone and Central Ohio were unlawful and in the violation of the amended ESA. According to an article by Daniel F.R. Dinger, wildlife officials were unable to find a zoo or animal park willing to take the wolves, and because Canada, the land of their origin, was unwilling to take them back, the judge's order was effectively a death sentence for the reintroduced wolf populations. So you can see how these issues impacted so much more than just angry ranchers. It affected the politics of the area and dealt a hard blow to the organizations trying to conserve the wildlife in the park. And those economic impacts from the wolves too. With the wolves being eradicated, it would slow down wolf tourism. It might bring in other tourists, but a lot of the revenue that the park receives is from wolf tourism. With the wolves being reintroduced into Yellowstone, it would bring back a lot of money that the park has lost over the years. Wolf tourism is a huge part in the local economies around Yellowstone. People come to Yellowstone to see them, sightsee the area and how the revenue was lost. But with the reintroduction, it brings back a lot of that tourism. So you see, we have to reintroduce the wolves. If the wolves are reintroduced into the ecosystem, everything goes back into balance. There are many direct effects and many indirect effects. Firstly, the elk population will go back to where it needs to be, and the coyote population will go down too. The indirect effects are those of the plants and being able to rebound from the elk overeating them. This will then lead to less erosion on the land, and the range will have better quality. There are only so many producers, and without the wolves, those producers can die out, and with that happening, that will force all of the animals in Yellowstone to migrate to find more sources of food. But with the reintroducing of the wolves back into the park, it will control everything, keep everything in check. It just makes sense.
So what do you think we should do about it?
We want to reintroduce the wolves because it's wrong to take them out in the first place. We have an ecocentric view on things. Everything is important to the ecosystem, and we want to preserve its biodiversity. It's more of an ethical view because it would make sense to preserve everything we can. It's morally wrong to kill animals that are not affecting you much either. Who are we to come into an area once teeming with wolves that supported our ecosystem as a whole and kill them off? Humans over time seem to be the cause of their own issues or demise. At first, we don't care about the ecosystem because it appears that humans can do whatever we want with it and with no consequence. However, when we find out that the ecosystem has a great effect on us, more than we originally expected, the humans will scramble and try to fix what they have done. So you can see how we really need to be reintroducing the wolves. It would make the biodiversity so much better, and the ecosystem would be how it's supposed to be. We do not want to interfere with an ecosystem that's probably functioning on its own. So we need to get the wolves back where it's supposed to be.